In 1997, the Russian space station Mir made world headlines. A series of accidents and near disasters not only jeopardized the lives of the astronauts on board, but raised serious doubts about the future of the Russian space program. These incidents were caused by blunders both on board and on the ground. At the time, Mir was the last remnant of Russia's proud space heritage. Even with insufficient funding, the Russians were determined to keep Mir operational as long as possible. The 1960s were dominated by the space race between Russia and the United States to put a man on the moon. The United States succeeded in July 1969, but the prohibitive cost of the Apollo program brought it to an end in 1972. But unmanned probes continued to be sent into the rest of the solar system, traveling deeper into space. Manned spaceflight then took a different direction. The new Soviet and American manned spaceflight programs concentrated on developing the skills to sustain life in space. This idea produced space stations. The first U.S. space station was Skylab. Its early missions ran from 1973 to 1974, culminating in Skylab 4. 3 astronauts spent 84 days in space. Despite early problems, Skylab was highly successful. After Skylab, the United States concentrated on developing a reusable space shuttle. Its first manned orbital flight was in 1981. Shuttles have been used ever since. The first Russian space station program was Salyut. The climax of the program came in 1985 when the cosmonauts on board Salyut 7 spent 237 days orbiting the Earth. But the Russians were designing a more ambitious space station, Mir. Unlike the previous space stations, Mir was designed to be permanently manned. It would consist of a number of modules that were assembled in space over time. The core module, Mir itself, was put into orbit on February 19, 1986. At that time, the mighty Soviet Empire was beginning to collapse. The old guard was swept away. Mikhail Gorbachev was at the helm. He realized that the arms race with the United States was crippling the Soviet economy. In Afghanistan, Soviet forces had been propping up a puppet regime since the end of 1979. It had become the Russian Vietnam. Casualties mounted and disillusionment grew. The entire Soviet system needed a new direction. It would require ruthless cuts in public expenditures, but the space program would be spared. In 1987, the second module of Mir, Kavant 1, docked with the core. This provided the resources to research the physics of the galaxies. One of the cosmonauts involved in the operation, Yuri Romanenko, remained behind on Mir and spent a record-breaking 337 days in space. He was relieved by Vladimir Titov and Musa Manarov, who pushed the record to 366 days. The unmanned Progress space freighters supplied cosmonauts with necessities. Despite domestic problems, the Russians were proving they could still match the United States in space technology. But in 1989, mass agitation toppled dictatorial communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The unrest quickly spread to the USSR itself. Amid growing anarchy, many of the USSR's so-called republics demanded complete autonomy. This increased the strain on the economy. Gorbachev was forced to make even more drastic cuts in spending. This time, the space program was affected. One immediate result was a delay in completion of the next Mir module, Cavant 2, and for 6 months, Mir was put in mothballs and was unmanned. Cavant 2 was finally placed in position in December 1989. Its purpose was to provide biological research data both in space and by observing the Earth. It also contained an airlock that made spacewalks possible. The Mir program appeared to be back on track. The Kristall module was added in 1990. This would be used to experiment in growing food in space, so astronauts could become self-sufficient for voyages to distant planets. Kristall also had a docking port for Russia's Buran space shuttle. Although Buran had made a successful maiden flight in 1988, cutbacks curtailed further flights. Buran ended its days in Moscow's Gorky Park. It was the first indication of compromises the Russians would have to make. Unlike the United States with its successful space shuttle, the Russians were forced to rely on an aging rocket-launched Soyuz spacecraft to send relief crews to Mir. Supply shipments still relied on the unmanned Progress space vehicles. In August 1991, communist hardliners tried to depose Gorbachev. He was placed under house arrest. For a while, it looked as though Russia's move toward democracy had ended. But the coup was crushed. Still, by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The Mir program continued, apparently unaffected by the political turmoil below. Teams of 3 cosmonauts spent an average of 6 months aboard Mir before being relieved. But back on Earth, the Russian space program was facing a dire financial crisis. Mir was aging rapidly. This would soon lead to massive problems. In an effort to overcome its economic shortfall, the Russian Space Agency made a deal with NASA. In return for US dollars, American astronauts could spend time on Mir. NASA's motivation for this agreement was the International Space Station Alpha, under development to eventually replace Mir. It would be a cooperative venture between Russia, the United States, Japan, and the European Space Agency. The United States saw participation in Mir as a way of helping the Space Station Alpha project. The first U.S. astronaut to visit Mir was Dr. Norman Thagard. 100 NASA officials went to Russia to witness the launch of the Soyuz, which carried him to Mir on March 14, 1995. Thagard was warmly welcomed by Mir's crew and spent 3 months with them in space.
Liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis with the Russian docking module, the threshold to world cooperation in space.
In June of the same year, the U.S. Space Shuttle Atlantis took off on an historic mission. It would link up with Mir. This was the first time a Russian and American spacecraft linked up in space since the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. The shuttle link-ups with Mir were designed to develop procedures for Space Station Alpha. It was also another way to transport American astronauts to Mir. With that in mind, the Space Shuttle Atlantis delivered a new docking module to Mir in November 1995. Other modules were added to Mir. One was Spectre, which included 4 solar arrays and scientific equipment for observing Earth. The other, added in April 1996, was Priroda, which gave Mir the ability to do remote sensing of Earth. But by 1997, Mir had been orbiting the Earth for over 10 years. With the exception of the additional modules, most of the equipment on board was wearing out. The core module for Space Station Alpha was supposed to be launched by the Russians that May, but they had fallen behind schedule, so Mir had to go on when it should have been retired. The potential for disaster grew. Astronaut Michael Foale spent 140 days on Mir in 1997. He likened it to the interior of someone's junk-filled garage. Old experimental apparatus, which had not been used for years, cluttered Mir's interior. Some of it had been delivered by foreign astronauts visiting the space station, but the Russians would not dispose of it. The fact that it was still on board was used to collect money from abroad. The smell of oil was everywhere. Dampness from condensation added to the crew's discomfort. There was also an increasing incidence of leaks of ethylene glycol, which was used to regulate interior temperature. The onboard clutter and the need for constant routine maintenance and repairs added to the stress and fatigue of the Mir crews. The system of paying the Russian cosmonauts was also questionable. Their basic pay was low, but they were given bonuses for conducting various operations. A spacewalk was worth $1,000, as was a manual docking. The chance of a serious accident on the decaying Mir was steadily increasing. Yet the Russian Space Agency appeared oblivious to the growing hazards and to the risks to the lives of the crew. To them, Mir was the remaining symbol of the once mighty Soviet space program. It had to remain operational regardless of the danger. But 1997 would be Mir's critical year. By February 1997, Mir had been in orbit for 11 years. Now a series of mishaps occurred. That month, there was an unexplained fire in Mir's Kavant-1 module. It threatened the entire station. The cosmonauts on board managed to extinguish it before serious damage was done. Nevertheless, it should have been a warning that all was not well. Two weeks after the fire, a Progress cargo craft had to be abandoned in space after the automatic docking system malfunctioned. The parts for this were made by a Ukrainian firm and were not high quality. And since the firm had not been paid, it had stopped making replacement parts. From then on, Progress dockings had to be carried out manually, which was more dangerous. On June 25, 1997, another unmanned Progress cargo ship arrived. On board Mir were the Russians Vasily Zibliev, the commander, flight engineer Alexander Lazutkin, and NASA astronaut Michael Foale. Ground control ordered Zibliev to practice a manual docking of Progress, but the technique was extremely cumbersome. Zibliev had to rely on images from a video camera located in the nose of Progress. He used these pictures to position properly to receive the Progress. Zibliev then used remote controls to guide Progress into Mir's docking port. He soon noticed that Progress was approaching very fast. He warned ground control, which appeared unconcerned. Progress continued its approach. At a critical moment, Zibliev lost the picture on his screen. He ordered Lazutkin and Foale to check Progress from Mir's observation ports. Then the picture returned. The next minute, there was a jolt. The Progress struck a solar array and a radiator on the Spectre module. This, the first space vehicle collision, caused heavy damage. It immediately reduced pressure within Spectre and caused a severe power loss. Mir's crew, struggling in the darkness, reacted quickly, sealing off the leaking Spectre. Ground control ordered them to shut down the thermal control systems in the Cavant 2 and Crystal modules, as well as the oxygen production and carbon dioxide removal systems in Crystal. This left the crew with only emergency oxygen supplies. Back on Earth, millions wondered how long the crew could survive on board the crippled Mir. The crew managed to maneuver Mir toward the sun to recharge its batteries, but the stabilizers needed to remain in that position kept failing. The crew continued to struggle for survival as the world held its breath. Then, another Progress cargo ship carrying repair equipment was launched. On July 7th, 12 days after the collision, it successfully docked with Mir. But the strain was beginning to tell on Zibliev, whom ground control blamed for the original collision. He began to suffer from heart problems. Another sign of pressure came when one of the crew accidentally pulled a computer connection and plunged the station into complete darkness. By now, the United States was questioning the future of Mir and its continuing involvement in the Space Station Alpha project. The Russians, however, were determined not to abandon Mir. The necessary repairs were conducted. Mir had narrowly avoided a disaster. In the eyes of many, the crew had been subjected to an unacceptable risk. Only their knowledge and skill had prevented the disaster. Mir continued to be manned, but the last NASA astronaut to spend time on board left in June 1998. The Russians on Mir had to spend more and more time just to keep the systems functioning. Meanwhile, the launch of the core element of Space Station Alpha was postponed during 1998. The Russian contribution fell further behind. In mid-1998, the Russian Space Agency finally announced that Mir would be abandoned in 1999. The disasters that almost doomed it resulted from the fundamental blunder of keeping it in space too long on too tight a budget. But the lessons learned from the Mir blunders will hopefully ensure that its successor, Space Station Alpha, will not repeat them.